Nick and his wife had reached a place in their marriage where it was just sad. They were disconnected. They felt apart. There's just joy was gone. And so Nick began meeting with the pastor, saying, how can I get my marriage restarted? And the pastor became concerned because Nick would talk about things that really started to freak him out. Like he said, vulnerability freaks him out. And he thought, how are you gonna have a close marriage if vulnerability freaks you out? So they started to get into Nick's past, and they saw a very dysfunctional childhood, and it made sense to the pastor then why it might be hard for Nick to connect with his wife. And while they're going through this process, we're talking months, Nick had a dream. And in the dream, he saw the pastor, and the pastor looked at Nick and said, hey, Nick, I want you to adopt an orphan. Nick said, who? The pastor said, you. And Nick took that as confirmation that for his marriage to be restored, he needed to go back to that beaten up, discouraged, and shamed child and speak the truth of Christ that he knew and the power of Christ and the healing affirmation of Christ so that he could have that child released and he could become the kind of adult who was able to connect with a woman. And what Nick's story teaches us is this: you can't have a healthy marriage if there's not a spiritually healthy you. Let's say you were a young girl. Every day seemed like a bad hair day. Maybe you were too smart or not smart enough, too loud or too quiet. You never felt like you fit in and you were just preyed on by the mean girls group. Can you now, as an adult, come and adopt this child spiritually and speak all that you know of the truth and the healing power and the presence of Christ so that you don't stay that child, but you grow up to become the woman that God created you to be and the kind of woman who can have a healthy, intimate marriage with their husband? Or maybe you're a young boy. Maybe you were bullied. Maybe out of insecurity, you became the bully. Maybe you acted like too much of a boy or not how others thought a boy should act, and you just grew up with a lot of shame. Can you, as an adult, speak God's truth and healing and comfort, all that you know now of his truth, so that you can release that boy to grow up to become the adult, the healthy adult that God created you to be, so that you can have the kind of marriage God created you to be? Listen, a spiritually healthy you requires that you respond to the presence of Christ instead of the hurt in your past. And so often as a pastor, I see people there still responding to the hurt of their past. They're not responding to Christ in the presence, and it's holding them down in every area of their life, beginning in particular with their marriage. And we're speaking this morning on the foundation of marriage. And here's what I want to suggest is certainly one of the foundations of marriage. The foundation of marriage is this: it's a humble commitment to keep growing in holiness. Now, this might sound bizarre to some because you may have accepted the world's view of holiness as restricting or a bunch of rules or a bunch of things. How could that serve marriage? I don't want you to think of holiness as stupid religious rules. Think of holiness as adopting that young girl or that young boy. Think of holiness as becoming whole, as becoming spiritually healthy. That's how the Bible presents it. And so that's how we go into a stronger marriage. And singles, this is just as relevant for you because if you accept this, you can begin laying the groundwork for a spiritually happy and healthy marriage even before you meet the person you're supposed to marry, if a happy marriage is based on a humble commitment to keep growing in holiness. Paul calls all believers to this. In 2 Corinthians 7:1, the Apostle Paul says this: let us purify, what's that fourth word? Ourselves. He doesn't say purify our spouse. That'd be kind of fun, right? If you were commanded to purify our spouse. He doesn't say purify our kids. He doesn't say purify the obnoxious, mean people who, when you're waiting in line at Memorial Park to get a parking place, they jump in front of you down further on when you've been waiting 10 minutes for that spot. You would be justified to want to purify them, but that's not who Paul says we're to purify. He says purify ourselves. And then he goes on to say, from everything. Reason a lot of us don't take spiritual growth seriously is we say, look, I've gotten the bad things out of my life. There's nothing scandalous in my life. But Paul doesn't say, purify yourself from the big things. He says, purify yourself from everything that contaminates body and spirit. Not just the physical sins that people usually talk about, but the spiritual sins, the attitudinal sins, prejudice, bitterness, envy, malice, hatred, judgment. Then he goes on to say, perfect holiness, perfecting holiness. In Greek, that's present tense. It's ongoing. We are declared holy in Christ, but experiential holiness, what Paul's talking about here, it's something that has to be perfected. It's practice. We're polishing it off, and we do all of this, Paul says, out of reverence for God. So Christianity, according to Paul, is a one-time decision that unleashes an all-the-time pursuit. There is a one-time decision when we're made holy, but holiness is also an all-the-time pursuit to experience that holiness with which we've been given. And so some of you have to go back to that young child. And if you don't heal that child, your marriage will suffer. Some of you need healing because you're so sensitive. If somebody shames you or you think they disrespect you, it's like World War III because you're still responding to the hurts in the past. You're not responding to the present healing touch of Jesus Christ. Some of you need to seek healing from the past because you've learned to medicate your past with sins and addictions that are destroying you and potentially destroying your family. And marriage is one of the best places where we can experience this all-the-time pursuit of holiness. There's nothing like it. Thomas and Kathleen Hart write this: sometimes what is hard to take in the first years of marriage is not what we find out about our partner, but what we find out about ourselves. As one young woman who had been married about a year said, I always thought of myself as a patient and forgiving person. Then I began to wonder if that was just because I'd never before gotten close to anyone. In marriage, when John and I began dealing with differences, I saw how small and unforgiving I could be. I discovered a hardness in me that I had never experienced before. Her story is so my story. Matthew McConaughey in his high school class was voted most handsome. I was not voted most handsome. I was not voted most athletic. I was not voted most popular or most likely to succeed. I was voted the far more coveted title, most polite, right? And I knew that's a geeky title, but I'm the third of 4 kids. I'm good with that. My motto in life is copacetic, right? Let's just get along with each other. We don't need the drama. And that's the view I carried of myself into marriage. I'm a pretty laid-back guy. I don't get irritated easy. It's fine. And then I was so surprised that when I got married to this incredible woman, one of our first biggest issues was ice cube trays. It was a family I grew up in. If you got on an ice cube, you're supposed to refill the tray and put it back in the freezer so the next person would have a nice full tray of ice cubes. And I'm convinced that's the biblical way to handle yourself in the kitchen. My wife, unfortunately, she came from a family where it was almost a contest how small of an ice chip they could leave in that tray. And so I'd have these warm Pepsis early on in our marriage, and I was just frustrated at my inability to explain to my new bride how much of my joy and happiness in life depended on this nice full tray of ice cubes. But she's speaking romantically to me one evening. I thought, here's my chance, right? I got her. Said, Gary, I'm gonna love you forever. I looked at her and said, honey, I don't need you to love me forever. I need you to love me for 7 seconds. She's like, what are you talking about? I said, I timed how long it takes to fill the ice cube trays and to put them. I know, that's as pathetic as it gets. And I never thought of myself as irritable like that. I never thought of myself as the kind of guy where ice cube trays could actually become a point of contention. But that points us back to 2 Corinthians 7:1, the all-the-time pursuit that marriage gives us opportunities to see where we're not quite as holy, where we haven't really perfected holiness like we think we might. Now, some of you might say, well, why do we have to purify ourselves? We've been forgiven. I can just accept what Christ has done. Why do I have to perfect holiness? This is so key. You need to know this. Even though Christ has delivered us from the guilt of sin, sin doesn't want to let you go. Sin fights every day to get you back. Your hurt wants to reclaim you. Sin fights for sin. So you have to fight for you. Sin fights for sin. So you have to fight for you. 1 Peter 2:11 says this, abstain from sinful desires. Now catch this, which war against your soul. If I could speak to the younger pre-marrieds here, and I know not all pre-marrieds are younger, but this 10 years old and up, teens, early 20s, I gotta be honest with you. What this verse talks about is something we never graduate from. I just turned 55, and it's still true for me. I will have desires that I know are not right. And I see them, and the opportunity presents itself, and my conscience might go pinging, danger, Will Robinson, danger, Will Robinson. But I know, if I'm honest, I want that. And if I'm honest, I might say, I probably will enjoy it a little bit. But health, wholeness, spiritual life comes from mental warfare here. Remember, Romans 12:1 says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, where we can admit it, not deny it, but admit it, and just mentally say, you know what? I know I desire this. And I know I might even enjoy it. But this desire is warring against my soul. And then accepting, nobody is for me like God is for me. I have no truer friend. And if he's telling me, don't go there, there's a good reason. It's never to withhold pleasure. It's never to withhold the good and the things that I really need. I've got to say no. Because God says no, I'm going to say no. And that's what leads to spiritual health. And young people, you will so bless yourselves if you learn to do those mental exercises. If you realize, yes, you will have desires. Christianity isn't the cessation of those desires. It's learning to submit them to Jesus Christ and to let him call the shots. And the spiritual foundation then recognizes that we need to grow in holiness, because these desires don't just war against our soul. These desires war against our marriage. If we don't deal with them, they impact our marriage. In his recent autobiography, Frank Shorter, who won the gold medal in the 1972 Olympics and the silver medal in the 1976 Olympics, said that on any given elite marathon, there are only about 10 men, or if it's a women's marathon, women, who are physically capable of winning. You've got a lot of people running, but most of them, they're not gonna win. He says it's even less than that, because you've got some that are having a bad day, or their training didn't go right, or they're injured, and so your job is to sort of figure out who has the capability of beating you on that given day. Now, in the 1972 Olympics, older people will remember, it was a terrible thing where some terrorists broke into the Olympic Village, kidnapped some Israeli athletes, and eventually those athletes were killed. It was awful. The Olympics had a day of mourning, and what they did is they pushed off the games for a day. So now the Olympic marathon that year was pushed off, in 24 hours it'd be run the next day. After that was announced, Frank was with a number of the other runners, and Ron Hill, who had the fastest time in the marathon in the world that year, so certainly considered one of the favorites, just started going on. I can't believe they would do this. Don't they understand how carefully calibrated marathon training is, that we set it up for just that day? You can't just push it off a day. These are people, obviously they've never run. They don't understand what a big deal. Why would they do this? And Frank was just chill. He goes, hey, we've been training for this our entire lives. One day isn't gonna make any difference. So I'm reading this account to Lisa, and I get into the point about Ron Hill. And she goes, that's you. I said, I know, but I don't want it to be me. I want to be like Frank Shorter. Because when I obsess about little things, when my routines get broken and I freak out, I make myself less effective, but I make my wife more miserable. Frank added in his autobiography, I knew then that Ron wasn't going to medal. He had already talked himself off the podium, and that proved to be true. And that's what we do in our marriages. I want to be more like Frank Shorter. I want to be less like Ron Hill, because here's the choice. And it's a choice everyone are making, whether we realize it or not. We can use our marriage to destroy our sin, or we can allow our sin to destroy our marriage. But if you think you can keep sin in a marriage without it having a bad consequence, you just don't understand the nature of sin. And the thing that makes it so concentrated in marriage is we're a two-person team. We're sort of like an Olympic beach volleyball team. This past summer, we had America's Best Team was April Ross and then the veteran, Kerry Walsh Jennings. And the match before the medal round was not a good match for the U.S. team. Kerry Walsh Jennings, though she's the veteran who's won 2 prior gold medals, she was having a bad match. And so the other team focused on her. They served to her. They attacked at her. And so, when you only got a 2-person team, you can't hide. And they kept doing it, and she would get the digs, and they wouldn't go out, and the slams weren't going and everything. And they ended up losing the match, which surprised a lot of people. But I love the way that Walsh Jennings just owned up to it after the match, and she said, you know what? I have to play better. And she did in the next match, and they won the bronze medal. But she recognized when you're a 2-person team, you both got to hold your own, because if there's a weakness, it's going to be exploited. And that's what happens in every marriage. You can have the most financially responsible spouse in the universe, and you alone can spend your marriage into oblivion if you're not controlled. You can have a spouse who is so filled with peace and joy and security in the Holy Spirit, and if you bring anxiety and negativity, you're going to pour poison into that marriage because you're a 2-person team. Now, some of you might be saying, well, Gary, if my marriage is about being a 2-person team, then we're toast because my spouse is awful. I saw the match where Kerry Walsh Jennings said she needed to play better. Her partner, April Ross, didn't play a perfect game. She made some mistakes. But Kerry Walsh Jennings understood, I can't control how April plays. I can only control how I play. We will be better as a team when I'm better as an individual. And that's how it works spiritually in marriage, although it's hard for us to accept that. I think of Marion. She was as disappointed in her husband as a woman could be. And she told me all the things she thought a pastor would be particularly appalled by. He didn't go to church with her as often as she would like him to. He didn't spend as much time with kids as she thought he should. He didn't hold her hand like he used to. And as she's going on and on about this, she alluded to a few things that she faced with, an addiction to food that led her to gain over 75 pounds since the day they got married. A really quick, biting tongue. She's a quick thinker, and she could be queen of sarcasm, and she knew that sometimes she wounded him and others with her remarks. She also mentioned that though it doesn't happen every year, sometimes it happens more than once a year, she can really get into fits of depression where she'll basically all but check out on her family for weeks on end. The thing is, she had so much understanding and empathy for her failings and nothing but bitterness and anger toward her husband's. She wasn't using marriage as a mirror, she was using it as a weapon, and I wasn't able to help her at all. I'm not a marriage therapist, I'm a pastoral counselor, which means if you come to me with a hard heart, there's nothing I can do. I'm not giving you strategies. She was more concerned about convincing me that she was just married to a really bad man than how she could become a godlier woman. But she didn't need to spend any time convincing me that, because I think every married woman is married to a difficult man. I mean, I just start there. But she wanted me to know that, and so the time was really just a waste. Here's the thing. None of us can change our spouse, but all of us can change our marriage by changing ourselves. That's the key. None of us can change our spouse, but all of us can change our marriage by changing ourselves. It calls us to a different view of marriage. Not marriage as emotional fulfillment or romantically being charged all the time, but really an opportunity where 2 people can live out 2 Corinthians 7:1 as a mirror, encouraging each other to become more like Jesus Christ. Or one way to put it is, what if God designed marriage to make us holy even more than to make us happy? I bet you could write a book about that. If you thought about it, there might be a book in there, I'm not sure. Some of you might say, why haven't I heard this? Why would we even look at marriage this way? Why does this sound new? Here's the thing. This world, this culture will never promote holiness because they don't understand how beautiful holiness is. They think holiness is restricting. They think holiness assaults life, not protects life. But here's words of truth. I don't know that you'll ever hear truer words than this. A holier you leads to a healthier you, which leads to a happier you, which leads to a happier marriage. That's God's way. Pursuing holiness, that's why we do it. Pursuing holiness, becoming a holier you, leads to a healthier you, which leads to a happier you, and that's what creates a happier marriage. Behind virtually every case of marital dissatisfaction lies unrepented sin. That's why I've often said couples don't fall out of love so much as they fall out of repentance. It's those sins and the attitudes that assault our affections for each other, even more than compatibility. So whenever I see somebody straining in their marriage, I'm actually looking for the sin behind the dissatisfaction. What is the sin that's stealing the wholeness, that's stealing the happiness? I think of Greg and Sharon. They had been married 10 years at the time, and Greg wrote code for a computer science firm. This was 15 years ago. I don't know what he's doing now. I don't know if they still do it like that. But he confessed that it was really difficult on his 10th anniversary because he's having an anniversary dinner with his wife, and he feels bored out of his mind. She's just telling him what the kids were doing that day, and somebody had spilled applesauce on the floor, and one of the kids had walked all through it, and he's just like, oh man, I'm supposed to care about that, and all of this. And then I really became concerned because whenever he talked about this female coworker of hers with whom he was writing code, his face lit up. He talked about how they solved this problem. It was so exciting. And then I'd bring back up the topic of his wife, and he would just lose all enthusiasm. And I pointed this out because I was really concerned for him, and he said, Gary, we just don't have much in common anymore. I said, yeah, except for the 3 kids. He goes, yeah, except for the kids. And then I pounced. That's not enough? Think about this. You committed to love and romance this woman, and you have checked out of your marriage emotionally. I can see it. That's fraud. You've let your heart grow cold. And you conceive these children, and you're feeding them, and you're clothing them, but you're not involved with them like your wife is. You're not training them. You're not discipling. You don't want to be a part of their day. You're not delighting in them because you've let your heart be stolen by this coworker with whom you can write code that you and I know will be out of date in 18 months. It'll be a joke. And that excites you more than loving the woman you promised to love and loving and raising the kids that you've conceived. That's what's going on. He's like, ouch. I didn't think about it like that. But see, that's what happens when our sin is exposed. We don't want to see it as sin. Because it sounds monstrous to say, I got this woman to marry me, and then I checked out, and I'm becoming infatuated with someone else. And I conceive these children, but now they kind of bore me, and I'm going to find my focus in my vocation and an extramarital relationship. That sounds too monstrous, so it doesn't sound quite so bad as, my wife's just kind of gotten boring. She's got a small life. How am I supposed to relate to that? That's how sin fights for sin. Don't notice me. There's really a better explanation, and I see this all the time. One of my best friends, one of the things I love about him is that he's strong where I'm weakest. I've been a people pleaser. He's just right up in people's face. And we had a mutual friend. It was just a really sad story, a rather younger guy, about our age, who died with cancer after several years of battling. It's just awful to see that happen. And in the last year or so, when things were getting really rough, there was this other man who sort of was consoling the wife, Brian's wife. Brian was a cancer victim. And his wife had died of cancer, and so at first it was just, I know what you're going through. And then my friend and I, we both became concerned because it was clearly becoming more than consoling. It was becoming romantic. We don't think it ever became physical, but they were clearly over the top because basically the day after Brian died, they were together and they went on a trip together the next weekend. We didn't want to leave this, the widow alone, so we were still getting together some, and And the thing that was so difficult about getting together is that the guy who had consoled her, when we were together, I think maybe his conscience was ticked or something. I mean, he kept cutting down Brian. He would say mean things. He would undercut his character. And I was so proud of my friend when he spoke up and he said, look, Brian wasn't a perfect man, but he's a good man. He was a good man. And I'll tell you this, if Brian had lived 100 lives, he wouldn't have romanced a cancer patient's wife while he was dying in any one of them. He would never do that. Awkward. But see, this guy knew, I can't be the kind of guy who would pull a wife away from her dying husband just when he needs her most. That's not me. But if he can turn Brian into a monster, he's saving her from the monster, right? He was rewriting reality because sin fights for sin. Sin doesn't want to say, kill me. Sin wants to kill you. But we have to let marriage be the mirror to say, this is what's really going on so that we get rid of the sin because we have a Savior who is powerful enough to forgive us our sin and to transform us into His image. Look, I am capable of great evil. You are capable of great evil. It's why we need a great Savior, and it's why we need to purify ourselves from everything that contaminates body and spirit and perfect holiness out of reverence for God, because if we don't deal with the sin, it tends to grow, and it turns us into the kind of people we never thought we would be. And if we approach marriage in the right way, it's like looking at a photograph. When I was marrying my wife, I'd like to say I was 6 feet tall. I'm not sure that was ever true, but that's the number I gave myself. Weighed 130 pounds, had a 28-inch waist. I turned 40, had never really thought about it much, and somebody showed me a family photograph, and I said, who is that guy with a couple of chins? And I said, it's you. I'm not chubby. But that was me. And that's when I started doing marathons, which worked until I moved to Texas, but that's a whole different thing. That's a different issue I won't get into. But it's looking at that photograph and it's saying, this is who you really are. Marriage is like that. It gives you these photographs. This is who you are, and we can either deal with it or we can attack the photographer, our spouse, or a friend who points it out. If we approach marriage in the right way, whenever marital dissatisfaction rears its ugly head, we just go back. Am I, out of reverence for God, purifying myself from everything that contaminates body and spirit, or have I stopped? The times that I am happiest and most fulfilled in my marriage are the times when I'm intent in drawing meaning and fulfillment from becoming a better husband rather than demanding a better wife. I don't know why this works. I just know that it does. Listen, here's a human condition. I love the way William Gurnall, he wrote this 17th century classic, he's a Puritan, called The Christian in Complete Armor. Here's how he presents it. He says, we live in a storm of sin. You can't live in this world without being rained on by sin, our own sin, others' sin, a world of sin. We're all living in a storm of unholiness, of unhealthiness, of addictions, and all that. He goes, Christians and non-Christians alike. So what makes Christians different? And Gurnall would say only this: Christians are intent on riding out of the storm, and those who don't reverence God are riding deeper into it. And so that's what I'm asking you today. Are you riding out of the storm? When you see the desires that war against your soul, are you realizing this isn't where I want to go? And are you pointing at the horizon and seeing the sun and riding out of it? Or are you going ever deeper into it to become the kind of person that eventually you'll be appalled that you've become? Use your marriage to ride out of the rain. You can preach this sermon today. The more we grow in holiness, the healthier we become. The healthier we become, the happier we become. The happier we become, the happier our marriages become. You can preach that with me, right? Say it with me. The more we grow in holiness, the healthier we become. The healthier we become, the happier we become. The happier we become, the happier our marriages become. You want a foundation for marriage? Dear friends, let us purify ourselves from everything that contaminates body and spirit, perfecting holiness out of reverence for God.